Hey friends, Elizabeth here from Plant-Based Bride, and I'm back again with another video. This time it is a watercolor with me. It is the process of this first moon that I painted for my July Plan With Me video, which you should go check out if you haven't seen already. And I got requests to do a slowed down version where you could really see what I was doing, and I talked you through it. So that is what this video is. I'm using this Strathmore watercolor paper. It is cold pressed, which means it has more of a rough texture versus hot pressed, which has a smooth texture. I'm using the cap of a candle to draw a circle that is approximately the size I wanted for my bullet journal. And then I'm erasing it so it gets really, really light. So when I'm done, you won't really be able to see the line because I won't be able to erase it once I paint over it. These are the materials I bought for watercolor painting. For this moon, I actually only used one of those four colors on the left, which is this Payne's Gray. So I used the Payne's Gray, Winsor & Newton Cotman watercolor paint. I got the 8 milliliter tube, but you can get different sizes. All the materials will be linked in the description box for you. So I'm starting by squeezing some of the paint onto my palette out of the tube, and I'm grabbing the larger of my two brushes. This is the 5 brush, and picking up some water from my jar, dipping it into the pigment, and then just kind of wiping off some of the pigment so it won't be quite so dark before I start painting. And I'm using a reference photo for this moon. I will try to find the exact photo that I was using. It was from Google Images, and put it on the screen so you can see what I'm referencing here. But at the start here, all I'm doing is using my wet brush with pigment on it on dry paper, and I'm just starting to kind of map out where the dark areas of the moon are in my reference photo. When I feel like my brush is kind of drying out or running out of pigment, I just pick up a little bit more water and a little more pigment and go right back to the page. As I've said about a million times before, I think reference photos are so important for art, for me anyway. I'm not great at painting or drawing from my imagination. I do sometimes, but it just never turns out quite how I like it. I really need to use reference photos, and usually a bunch of reference photos, to get the kind of effect that I end up liking. So here I picked up a lot more pigment than I had previously, and as you can see, it is way darker. And that's the thing with watercolor, is depending on how much water you have on your brush and how much pigment you have on your brush, you can get a super light, washed out, barely there color, or you can get a super, super dark color just using one pigment. So it's kind of fun to play around with, and that's why I was able to do this entire moon using only one color, because I could get the super light areas and the super dark areas all with the same pigment. So I'm still doing the exact same technique of the wet brush on the dry paper, just mapping out those dark areas and kind of adding a little bit more pigment and pushing the pigment I do have on the page around a little bit more to spread it out. Disclaimer time, I am a watercolor beginner. I mentioned this in my July Plan With Me video, but this moon that I'm painting in front of you is the first thing I ever painted with using watercolors. I'm a beginner. I'm not an expert. I'm not pretending to be an expert. I'm not telling you how to do it. All I'm doing is showing you the footage a little bit slower, which is what you all asked for, and talking you through what I'm doing in more detail so you get an idea of my process. Here I added water to my brush and pigment, and then dried it off a little bit on a paper towel that's off screen so it wouldn't be quite so wet as I put it onto the page. And this whole beginning section is really just all the same stuff. I'm just trying to kind of loosely get the pigment into the shapes of where the dark areas of the moon fall. And there I was checking to see if I was bleeding through the paper, because I haven't used watercolor paper before, and I'm so used to worrying that my journal is gonna bleed through the pages when I use my tombows in my journal. And I'm just really used to flipping the page and making sure that I'm not ghosting or bleeding through yet. And so I checked on the watercolor paper, even though it's made for watercoloring, so I wasn't ghosting through because it's super thick paper, which is, you know, what it's made for. But I just thought that was funny. So once I'm generally happy with where the darker areas are, I'm adding a bunch of water and just a little bit of pigment to my brush and starting to roughly outline the moon, just to fill in those areas of the moon that are lighter. And I'm not worrying too much about perfection here. I'm generally following the pencil line that I can still see, but I'm not worrying about perfection because the moon isn't a perfect sphere. Moons have craters and, you know, hills and valleys and etc. So, but I'm not too worried about perfection, just generally spherical, you know. And the nice thing about watercolor is that you can use a little bit of pigment and it can go a long way. You can keep adding more water and really spread out that pigment, and it will make it lighter, but you can really cover a large area using a tiny amount of pigment if you don't mind it being more of a wash of color. And that's basically what I'm doing to fill in all those open spaces. I just keep adding more water and spreading the pigment around until it fills in all the white areas that I can still see that are just the bare paper. I also decided to add more water to my brush and kind of blur out the edges of the darker areas just to make it a little bit of a more gentle progression from the light areas to the dark areas. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't do this video at regular speed. It just would have been too long. I spent a long time on this moon because it was the first moon I ever painted and I wanted it to turn out well. So I kept going back in and adding more, and I was going pretty slowly. So this is 2 times the speed, which I felt was still slow enough that you could really see what I was doing without it just getting excessively long and being kind of boring, to be honest. So I let my moon dry for a little bit, and once it had some time to air dry, I used my blow dryer to finish drying off that layer so I could start on the second layer. Don't start with your blow dryer when the paint is still wet. You may spread the paint across the page, which is not what you want. I did that a little bit in my July Plan With Me video on my second moon, and I will write somewhere on the screen or in the description box or something the timestamps. You can go to that video and see what happened there, but I spread the pigment across the page and that was not planned. So make sure that it has some time to dry before you start blow drying it. Okay, so now we're starting on layer 2 of the moon, and as you can see, it dried a little bit lighter than it looked when it was wet, which is common with watercolors for them to dry lighter. So the first thing I'm doing is just to go back in and really darken up some of those darker areas of the moon to layer some more paint on top. So first I wanted to start with a crater that basically disappeared in the drying process, but I really added too much water to this one and I ended up basically creating a puddle. And even when I tried to add darker pigment to it, it basically just sat on top of a little dewdrop of water on the page. So I end up fixing that in a little bit, but in the meantime, I'm picking up some of the extra pigment from that splotch and using it to start to darken up some of the other dark areas of the moon. And all of this really is that same process of just adding a little bit more pigment here, a little bit more pigment there, blending a little here, blending a little there, to try to get a look that kind of emulates my reference photo, but also that I just like, that I find visually pleasing, whether it's perfectly accurate or not. By the way, this is the 3rd time I've tried to record this voiceover because my editing computer keeps crashing and deleting all of the files, and it's very frustrating. So hopefully this will be the last time I do it, because I'm starting to forget what I've said before in other takes and what I've already said in this take. So just continuing to darken up all of these areas, and I finally decided to just blot that crater with my finger to pick up all that water and to go back in with a much drier brush and more pigment to really get that dark spot that I was looking for from the beginning. It's so hot in my apartment. I had to turn off the air conditioners so I could film this without air conditioner noise in the background. But it's so stiflingly hot in Toronto today. Oh my goodness. Also, I'm at the end of a cold, so I hope you enjoy my sick voice. So now I am wetting my brush and just blending that color out a little bit more and blending out some of the other little sections that I feel need it. And I am now starting to basically outline the right side of the moon there, picking up some pigment and just really outlining it. And then I go back in a moment and sort of blend it out. And that's, again, one of the nice things about using watercolors is that you can kind of start rough and then blend it out after. You don't have to be really careful about how you place it right from the beginning. It's an easy medium to kind of play around with and work with later and manipulate later. Any of these times that I'm kind of pausing here, I'm just looking at my reference photo and trying to figure out what the next thing I should do is, because like I said, I'm a super beginner here. One of the things that I noticed that was really bothering me is that the section I'm working on now looked to me like a horse head, and it was very distracting. It was like when you look at the clouds and you see an animal and then all you can see in the clouds is that animal. It was like that. All I could see in my moon was this horse head, so I had to change it. So I pulled down the nose section of the horse head down to the rest of the blob so that that horse head would be no more, and I could focus on other parts of the moon without just constantly looking at the part that I'd made to look like a horse head unintentionally. So here I'm starting to do something really, really fun that was one of my favorite parts of doing this moon, which is picking up just the tiniest bit of very watered down pigment and adding little splotches, little shapes, lines, dots, stripes, all kinds of little textures essentially to the light areas of the moon to give the moon some texture, to make it look like the surface is irregular. And that was a really, really fun part, just adding little dots, little lines. I think it added a lot to how the moon ended up looking. I think it looked a lot more realistic and more interesting. So I would highly recommend that if you are making your own moon, to play around with trying to create texture in the different areas and to add little patterns and things, little irregularities, because moons really have such an irregular surface for the most part. Obviously, there are lots of different types of moons, but when we think of our moon, for example, there's so many craters and irregularities in the surface. It's not just a smooth, perfect glass ball. So, and even though we're far away, when we look at the moon, we can still kind of get a sense of the irregularities on the surface, even from so far away. Here I just added some water to my brush and blended out a couple of the little sections I felt needed some blending. And after giving it some time to air dry, I blow dried it again to kind of firm up that second layer. So now that I'm happy with how my moon looks in those two layers, the actual color of the moon, I'm squeezing out a little bit of my zinc white gouache paint. And this is, again, my Winsor & Newton Designer's Gouache in the shade Zinc White. And it's essentially a watercolor with more pigment. It is a water-based paint, but it's more pigmented than your average watercolor. So it works well as a highlight on top of watercolor because the white actually stands out a little better than a white watercolor paint would. It's more opaque. So I'm starting with my thicker brush and just adding a couple areas of highlight. And something that I've noticed in a lot of representations of moons are these white dots with white lines radiating out from them as highlights. And I started trying to do it here, as you can see, with this bigger brush, and it just didn't really give the effect I was looking for. It looked quite undefined. It's pretty blended out, and that's not what I'd wanted originally. So I tried adding more paint to my brush and brightening up that spot and try to create those lines, and they were just looking too thick and not what I wanted at all. That was not the effect I was going for. So I added more water and I just blended out that white spot through that whole area and just made that just generally a bit of a lighter area of the painting. And it ended up being a good backdrop for the highlight that I created on top of it. So don't feel like you have to start all over. If you're not happy with something, you can always kind of blend it out and fix it after. I decided to use my smaller brush because I think that was part of the problem of that first highlight and why I didn't like how it turned out. So I added that dot again in that same spot and started adding white lines kind of radiating out from the dot. Trying to have a relatively dry brush so I could get more pigment from the white. Doing some shorter lines and some longer lines. I always get so out of breath when I film these voiceovers. I don't know why. I must talk differently than I normally talk when I film these. I don't normally get so out of breath when I talk. So I worked on this one highlight for a little while because I wanted to make it really bright white, a focal point of this painting. And as I said, this was my first time ever working with watercolors and gouache, so I didn't really know what to expect from it, and I was learning more about how it worked every time I touched my brush back down to the page. So here I added quite a bit of water to my brush and a little bit of pigment and started trying to flick pigment onto the moon. And as you can see, I'm not really getting that many flicks. I got a couple of them, but there weren't a lot. And you'll see in this video that I continue to try to get this kind of flicked all over splotched effect. And some of the flicks are more effective than others. I found on later moons that it's actually easier to have the brush underneath your hand and hit the brush from on top, and that kind of directs the flicks better than on top. But I hadn't figured that out on this first moon, so I was trying really hard to direct the splotches down while tapping from above. And here I'm going in and just adding some more deliberate, larger highlight dots to different areas of the moon. I wanted to have another highlight in the lower left-hand corner. Again, these highlights are based off of my reference photo. Adding a few more splotchy dots all over the place. I really feel like these dots and in general the highlights really add a lot to how the painting ends up looking. Again, kind of like how adding those shadowy bits and those details in the lighter areas really added a lot of dimension. I feel like the highlights also added a bunch of dimension to the moon and made it look a lot more interesting and realistic. Choosing some specific areas that I feel need a highlight dot. That was a way more effective flick. Look at all those new little splotches I got. So proud of myself. I'm learning. Look at all those little dots. Go me. I'm like a proud mom of myself. There we go. Now we're starting to get the effect I was going for. Here we go. Adding more pigment is working. So here is where I decided to make those other two highlights a little bit more noticeable by adding those sort of radiating lines out from them. Here I tried the technique of actually pulling some of the pigment from that center dot that I created out to create those lines, and I feel like that gave such an amazing effect. I'm really happy with how that ended up looking, and so I used the same effect on that lower left hand highlight, even though it's a little harder to see because it is on a lighter area of the moon, just like that first highlight. I still think it added quite a bit. Adding some more white pigment to the center of those three highlights so that they really stand out. They're very bright white. And of course, flicking some more white dots all over because I just really like how that looks. And that's it. That was the entire moon. That's what I did. That was kind of my thought process as I went along. I hope you enjoyed this video and that it gave you a little bit of insight into how I created this moon. I would love, love, love to see the moons you all create if you decide to create a moon, whether it's with watercolor or a different medium, which brings me to the fact that yes, I will be creating a tombow version of this using my tombow brush pens, so watch out for that. I'm hoping to be able to film it very soon and hopefully get it out for you in the first week of July. So watch out for that. I will be doing that, but please, please, please tag me on social media if you create your own moon. I would love to see it. All of my handles and links and things are in the description box below, especially on Instagram is a great place to tag me. I'm very active on Instagram. And I would love to see your recreations or your own versions, your own moons. These are some of the other moons I created in my July plan with me. Again, if you haven't seen that video already, please go check it out. You can see me create all of those moons and also set up my planner for July. If you are new to this channel and just stumbled upon my video, hey, welcome. I'm so happy that you stuck through this whole video. I hope that you liked it. And if you want to be part of this family here, we are very supportive and awesome because of all of you. That's why you're awesome, not because of me, although I am also awesome. Hashtag self-love. But this community is awesome because of all of you. So if you want to join, if you want to be part of this family, hit that subscribe button. Also like this video if you enjoyed it. It was really fun for me to make. And also hit that bell notification if you want to know as soon as that tombow moon video goes out, because it will be soon, but I can't guarantee a specific day because my life is hectic. So it'll get done when I can get it done, but hopefully soon. Hit that bell so that you will be notified as soon as it is up and ready for your viewing pleasure. And I will see you very soon in my next video. Bye, friends.